Tonight on Difference of Opinion, sex sells, but at what cost to our kids? Why are we sexualising children and young women in ads, magazines and music videos? Are advertisers and the media exploiting and harming children, or are we overreacting to a fast-changing popular culture? Good evening and welcome to Difference of Opinion. To give us their learned opinions on the sexualisation of the young, please welcome our panel. Associate Professor Catherine Lumby is the Director of the Centre for Social Research and Communication at the University of New South Wales. She's also a member of the Advertising Standards Board. Associate Professor Alan McKee runs the Film and Television degree at the Queensland University of Technology. He's written 5 books on popular culture and television. Melinda Tankard-Reist is a Canberra-based author and director of the national women's think tank, Women's Forum Australia. She's also editor of Faking It, a magazine exploring the way advertisers portray women's bodies. And Louise Newman is Professor of Perinatal and Infant Psychiatry at the University of Newcastle. She's a spokesperson on child mental health for the New South Wales College of Psychiatrists. A very warm welcome to you all. And who better to tell us about the power of images in the media than our resident cartoonist, Warren Brown?
Oh, thanks very much, Jeff. Look, as always, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Warren. The use of sex to sell has been with us since Adam and Eve, but today, children and very young women are both the targets and the subjects of raunchy ads, magazines and music videos. Is this sexploitation, and is it harming our kids? Melinda.
Jeff, Women's Forum Australia does believe it is exploitation of particularly young women and girls. Our research shows that there are many damaging effects on girls of sexualised, airbrushed, thin images of women, that these images are contributing to objectification, self-esteem issues, lower academic performance, depression, anxiety and eating disorders. So we agree with that, yes.
Louise, is that just a view, or is there now solid evidence that these images are affecting the way women grow up?
Look, I think that's the hard question. There certainly is some evidence. There's evidence that we're seeing an association between some media representations, particularly of young girls and women, and the sorts of problems that Melinda mentioned: depression, eating disorders, self-esteem. I think the big question is that we need to do much more research into is who's the most vulnerable, what should we be doing to protect those who are the most vulnerable, and what other factors are contributing, because it's bound to be a pretty complex interaction.
Catherine Lumby, you've done some work yourself on this issue. Do you agree with the findings of the American Psychological Association that there is a link between the imagery of young women and these eating disorders, the low self-esteem and even problems later in their sex lives?
Well, what I'd say, Jeff, is that it's a complex relationship, and I think we need to have a complicated debate about it. For one thing I would say is that really you will get images of women that are sexualising them in a society which is still pretty much patriarchal. I say that as a feminist. I mean, I have concerns in a way about the way women are positioned in society, definitely. But I think that goes back a very long way. And certainly I go back to the 60s and 70s when I was a young kid or a teenager, and nothing was that different then, even though we didn't have a lot of popular culture around us. And I'd like to respond to one of Melinda's points very quickly, to say that if we're talking about educational outcomes, one of the things I'm very happy to see is that we see young women, you know, going through high school, going to university now. So I guess overall I would say there are a lot more positive things happening for young women, but at the same time, you know, I don't want to dismiss concerns about how they're represented.
Alan, are we as a society expecting too much of young teenage women?
I think that everyone on the panel has said that we are living in a patriarchal society that makes things very difficult for women, and that includes in terms of mental health. The thing I worry about is that by blaming television, magazines and the media, we're actually shooting the messenger, and that means we're ignoring the real problems that make life difficult for women. I mean, the research that I did, for example, on negative attitudes towards women suggested that religion, lack of education, a lack of engagement with wider society were more of a problem in causing negative attitudes towards women than media consumption is. So I worry that if we blame the easy target, we're actually missing the real problems.
Would you agree, as a man, there is an enormous double standard running through advertising and media generally, where we expose women and we use sex related to women to sell?
I'm actually the wrong man to ask, I'm afraid, because being a gay man, I live in a culture where very much my culture uses gay men's bodies to sell things as much as women's bodies, so I see both.
Melinda?
I'd like to pick up on something Catherine said about not much has changed since the 60s. I actually think a lot has, actually. I don't think back then little girls were being sold padded bras and G-strings and being marketed pole dancing kits, for example. They weren't expected to be sexual in the same way they are now. And the research is pretty solid on the effect that that's having. So I think children are being treated in a sexual way, in a new way, that the onslaught of popular culture, the messages from magazines, television, I agree with you that it is broad. We do need to address it on a broad level. But the impact of popular culture, I think, can't even be compared to what was happening back in the 60s.
Could I respond, Melinda?
Sure.
It's an interesting question. I mean, and one of the things I did, because I spent 5 years looking at children's media consumption, and when you talk about research, I've looked at research too, and there's always research in research. So we can get away from that and just look at, I guess, the fact that, you know, I think if I went to the audience and said, look, you know, there'd be a lot of women sitting here who can remember being a child or a teenager in the 60s or 70s, at a time when popular culture certainly wasn't as saturated as it is now. But in a society in which, you know, young girls are going to dress up like their mums or going to behave in ways or aspire to behave in ways that are sanctioned by society. And one of, I mean, I've got two things I, you know, bring to the table anecdotally. One is an exercise book that my best friend and I did drawings of our fantasy wardrobe in, which included, this is in the 60s in Newcastle, where TV came in 2 channels and 1 colour, and it included a micro miniskirt, go-go boots, and a leather bikini. And I've got photographs of myself at high school with my friends who were all 14 in boarding school, dressing up in our bras, you know, dressing up like strippers. Now, we didn't want to be strippers, and we didn't want to be, you know, we weren't saying we wanted to be pole dancers when we grew up, but, you know, we were playing dress-ups in a way. We were performing gender and sexuality. And so one of the first things I'd say is that if you really have an objection to the sexualisation of women, then that's really about buying into a complete revolution about gender.
Louise, but in the 60s and 70s, we didn't see 12-year-old models who were dressing to sell products to adults. That's a new phenomenon.
No, I think we have to say that there's now a huge market. Children are now consumers. They're directly targeted as consumers. There's a whole agenda of marketing that's based around creating desires and needs in young children. But I think it's very important as we have this discussion that we distinguish between adolescence and how we deal with emerging sexualities, which is a totally different issue, and how we deal with marketing to pre-pubertal children. I mean, my concerns are what we're doing to children as young as 5 and 6 years old, who are not developmentally, emotionally or psychologically ready to be thinking about sexuality in an adult way. And what we're actually marketing to young children is adult sexuality and adult sexual fantasy. And that's, I think, a far more difficult and very serious issue.
Melinda, is this corporate pedophilia?
I think the term corporate pedophilia that Philip Adams actually invented is you know, it's a fair point, because we are grooming little girls to expect sexual advances from older men. For example, there was a recent issue of Barbie magazine, which was a cute crush issue, and it had pin-ups of all sorts of boys you might be interested in, you might have a crush on, your favourite celebrity dream date. And one of these boys was about 30 years old. So I think we are priming little girls to expect sexual advances from older men and telling them it's quite normal to have sexual feelings and to be approached in a sexual way by men who are older before these girls are willing to process it at all.
Alan, can we be explicit here? Aren't we really applying a double standard? Because we have an age of consent and we say that is the age in this society that we permit children to then become grown-ups for certain behaviour. But when it comes to the advertising of these images, we turn away from the age of consent and we accept very young girls now who are portrayed as sex objects. The objectification of their nature is sexual. Isn't that a double standard?
No, I'm not sure here. Are you talking about marketing to young girls or the use of young girls to market to adults? What are you talking about
Well, I
here?
suspect that what corporate pedophilia means is a little of both. That we are manipulating the audience to voyeuristically look at very young children, perhaps in a dangerous way, and we are clearly targeting tweens, as they are now identified by advertisers, as a new market to sell padded bras.
Well, can I jump in here for a second? Because people keep talking about research in this area, but can I say I actually went and did a forensic in Target, you know, and it's usually Target or Kmart, which are the places where people are complaining about this stuff being sold. And I've talked about this on numerous TV panels, and I went looking for a padded bra being marketed to 4-year-olds. And can I tell you, there are bras being marketed to 8-year-olds which have a certain amount of lining in them, you know, which might be pink and have spangly things on the outside. And some 8-year-old girls have breasts. You know, and the 8-year-old girls who have breasts do not want to be put in some kind of bra that screams surgical training device. You know, they want something that's pretty and pink. It's bad enough if you're growing breasts when you're 8. It's kind of scary. And I think that... And I remember girls growing breasts when they were 8, when I was 8 years old.
Melinda, are we really talking about the same ingredients here?
No, look, I don't think so. It's much broader than girls who legitimately do, you know, need some support because they're developing fairly early. It's much more mass market than that. I mean, we are turning little girls into walking billboards for the Playboy brand. There's currently a line of makeup being sold to young girls featuring Hef's favourite lip gloss and Tie Me to the Bedpost blush for them to wear. And I think often these girls don't even realise that they are being used to market the primary brand of the global sex industry. Girlfriend magazine recently had a Playboy T-shirt giveaway and said that cool girls wear the Playboy brand. This is what cool girls do. So I think it's much, much worse than just some girls needing some legitimate support because they're growing up earlier.
I suppose my question would be, the idea that you turn 16 and on your 16th birthday suddenly you become a man or a woman and you wake up thinking about sexuality, whereas you've never thought about that up to that point in your life, obviously makes no sense. Obviously, you have to spend the years up to that point negotiating with sexuality and working out what you like and who you are as a sexual person. So I suppose my question then is, at what age is a suitable time to start thinking about that? And Louise's point about the difference between prepubescent and pubescent is very important. So the idea that girls or boys under the age of 16 might be thinking about sexual things is not in itself a problem.
Well, look, there's of course a whole theory that would say that children from birth are interested in sexual things, but it's not adult sexuality, obviously, in the way that we would conceptualise it. So I think we have to be clear that we have to have an understanding of human development, and certainly adult sexuality imposed upon, and I do see it as an imposition on 5- and 6-year-olds, is developmentally inappropriate. Now, the children themselves, the other point is children themselves might quite enjoy dress-ups and wearing those clothes. They do. So it's not that the child necessarily at that point identifies it as sexual in an adult way, but it's a risky business.
Isn't that why we call this, Alan?
What's the age where it is appropriate to start thinking that kind of way?
Well, Alan, I want to bring you back to the point of the corporate pedophilia because you haven't dealt with it.
Yeah.
Isn't this why we have an age of consent? And in this case, we are taking very young girls and dressing them up to be sexual. Now, we ban that in other senses in our society. We accept that there is an age of consent, but we are allowing it, and it seems to me there is a voyeurism